the town that should have vanished. High on the side of Cleopatra Hill in northern Arizona stands a town that defied gravity, reason, and history. This is Jerome, a mining town built on copper, wealth, and ambition, then nearly destroyed by corruption, violence, disease, and disaster. At the beginning of the 20th century, Jerome was one of the richest mining towns in America. Money flowed, copper poured out of the mountain, workers arrived by the thousands. But with rapid growth came chaos. Jerome became overcrowded, unstable, and dangerous. Buildings clung to steep cliffs. Streets twisted unnaturally along the mountainside. And beneath it all, the ground itself was moving. Fires ripped through wood neighborhoods. Deadly mining accidents became routine. Shootings and stabbings filled police records. Disease spread faster than the town could control. At its peak, Jerome was known by a darker name, the wickedest town in the West. People died in the mines. People died in the streets. People died in hospitals overwhelmed by patients suffering from tuberculosis and industrial injuries. And yet, Jerome kept growing. Investors believed money could outrun danger. Officials ignored warning signs. And the mountain continued to give while quietly preparing to take everything back. When copper prices fell, when the mines closed, when the fires, landslides, and economic collapse hit all at once, Jerome didn't slowly fade. It nearly disappeared. Entire neighborhoods slid down the mountainside. Thousands left almost overnight. Businesses closed. The population collapsed. What remained was a broken town clinging to a cliff, abandoned, unstable, and written off as finished. But Jerome didn't die. Against all odds, it survived. This is the true story of Jerome, Arizona, the mining town that should have vanished, but refused to disappear. Copper, power, and the rise of Jerome. Jerome did not rise slowly. It exploded. At the turn of the 20th century, vast copper deposits beneath Cleopatra Hill turned a quiet mountainside into one of the most valuable mining zones in the United States. The metal was essential for electricity, telephones, railroads, and a rapidly modernizing nation. And Jerome sat on top of it. Mining companies moved in aggressively. Shafts were drilled deeper. Smelters roared day and night. Rail lines were carved into impossible terrain. Thousands of workers arrived almost overnight. Miners from across the United States, immigrants from Europe and Mexico, men willing to risk their lives underground for steady pay. Jerome became a company town, controlled largely by powerful mining interests. Housing was built fast and cheap. Entire neighborhoods were stacked along the cliff, balanced on stilts and narrow ledges. There was no room to expand outward, only upward or straight down the mountain. By 1910, Jerome was booming. Over 10,000 residents. One of the largest copper producers in Arizona. Hotels, theaters, newspapers, banks. Dozens of saloons and gambling halls. Constant noise, smoke, and movement. Money flowed freely, but control did not. A town under pressure. Jerome was overcrowded, polluted, and tense. The mines were dangerous. Cave-ins were common. Explosions killed without warning. Toxic fumes filled underground tunnels. Injured miners flooded the local hospitals. The town's infrastructure strained under the weight of rapid growth. Water was limited. Waste piled up. Fires spread quickly through tightly packed wooden buildings. And above it all, the mountain itself was unstable. Jerome wasn't built on solid ground. It was built on fractured rock, riddled with tunnels and voids carved out by relentless mining. The town was literally hollowing itself out. Power without balance. Mining companies held enormous influence. They controlled employment. They influenced law enforcement. They pressured local officials. Labor disputes were common. Strikes were crushed. Protesters were arrested or blacklisted. Violence didn't always come from criminals. Sometimes it came from desperation. Shootings broke out during strikes. Clashes between workers and guards escalated quickly. And corruption flourished where power was concentrated and oversight was weak. Jerome became wealthy, but unstable. It was a place where opportunity and danger existed side by side, where prosperity came at a constant human cost. And while copper kept flowing, the town's problems were tolerated. But beneath the noise, beneath the smoke and money, Jerome was quietly approaching a breaking point. Because the same forces that built Jerome, speed, greed, and pressure, were about to turn against it. Disaster, disease, and the beginning of the collapse. The collapse of Jerome did not begin with a single event. It began with pressure, building quietly, relentlessly, until the town could no longer absorb it. Fire on the mountain. In the early 1900s, Jerome burned again and again. Wooden buildings stood shoulder to shoulder. Narrow streets acted like wind tunnels. A single spark could turn into an inferno. Major fires swept through entire neighborhoods, destroying homes, businesses, and boarding houses in hours. Families lost everything overnight. Some rebuilt, others left for good. Each fire weakened the town's resilience. Each reconstruction was rushed. Each mistake was repeated. The invisible killer. But fire wasn't Jerome's deadliest threat. Disease was. By the 1910s, tuberculosis spread rapidly through the overcrowded town. Miners worked long hours underground, breathing dust and toxic air that destroyed their lungs. Injured and sick workers filled the hospitals. Jerome became a magnet for the terminally ill. Sanatoriums were built along the mountainside to isolate patients. Entire sections of town were associated with sickness and death. The sound of coughing echoed through thin walls. People began to fear Jerome not just as a dangerous place, but as a place you might never leave alive. The ground starts to move. As copper production intensified, the mountain itself began to respond. Years of aggressive mining hollowed out Cleopatra Hill. Tunnels collapsed. Rocks shifted. Foundations cracked. Buildings tilted. Porches pulled away from walls. Entire structures slid inches, then feet down the slope. Jerome was literally losing its footing. Engineers warned that continued mining could destabilize the town. The warnings were noted and ignored. Copper was still profitable, and profit came first. Violence without headlines. While disaster and disease chipped away at Jerome, violence continued quietly in the background. Police records filled with assaults, stabbings, and shootings. Labor disputes escalated into physical clashes. Law enforcement struggled to maintain order in a town stretched beyond control. Jerome earned a reputation across Arizona. Not just wealthy, not just dangerous, but unmanageable. The turning point. By the late 1920s, cracks were impossible to ignore. Fires had destroyed entire blocks. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Buildings were sliding down the mountain. Public trust eroded. Then came a moment that changed everything. Copper prices began to fall. For the first time, the town's economic engine slowed. Mining companies reduced operations. Layoffs followed. And Jerome realized a brutal truth. All the damage it had tolerated had only been survivable while the money kept flowing. Without copper, Jerome had nothing left protected. The crash, when copper left and Jerome emptied. When copper prices collapsed in the early 1930s, Jerome's foundation gave way almost overnight. The Great Depression didn't just slow the mines. It exposed how fragile the town had become. Mining companies cut shifts. Then they shut down entire operations. Smelters went quiet. Rail shipments stopped. Thousands of workers were suddenly unemployed in a town that had no alternative economy. An exodus down the mountain. Families packed what they could carry. Boarding houses emptied. Storefronts closed one by one. Within months, Jerome's population collapsed from thousands to mere hundreds. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned. Schools closed classrooms. Hospitals reduced staff. Sanatoriums emptied, not because people were cured, but because no one could afford to stay. The town that once roared with industry fell silent. The mountain takes what's left. As mining slowed, the consequences of decades underground became impossible to ignore. Without constant maintenance, tunnels collapsed. Sinkholes opened beneath streets. Buildings slipped further down the slope. Some structures were condemned. Others were simply left behind, too dangerous to save. Jerome began to look like a disaster zone frozen in time. The end of an era. In 1953, the last major mine closed. That moment marked the end of Jerome as a mining town. Electric lines were cut to unused areas. Water service was reduced. Roads deteriorated. What remained was a nearly empty shell clinging to the side of Cleopatra Hill, written off as finished, forgotten, and unsalvageable. Arizona officials openly discussed abandoning the town entirely. For most places, this would have been the final chapter. But Jerome's story wasn't finished, because while copper had left, something else was about to arrive. The reinvention. How Jerome refused to die. When the mines closed and the money disappeared, Jerome should have vanished. Most towns in its position did. But Jerome didn't. The town no one wanted. By the mid-1950s, Jerome was nearly empty. Buildings were abandoned. Streets were quiet. Entire sections of town were unstable and dangerous. Property was worthless. You could buy a house for almost nothing. If you were willing to risk landslides, collapsing foundations, and isolation. And strangely, some people were. Artists, outsiders, and risk takers. The first newcomers weren't investors or developers. They were artists, writers, musicians, people with little money but a high tolerance for risk. They saw something others didn't. Dramatic views, unique architecture, a raw, unpolished history, a town with a story instead of future. They moved into crumbling buildings and repaired them slowly, often by hand. They lived without reliable utilities. They accepted the danger, and in return, they gained something rare. Freedom. A new identity forms. By the 1960s and 70s, Jerome began changing quietly. Art studios replaced boarding houses. Galleries opened where saloons once stood. Small cafes moved into former company offices. The town leaned into its past instead of erasing it. Jerome didn't pretend it was safe. It didn't hide its scars. It didn't rebuild into something modern. It preserved the damage, from ruin to destination. As word spread, visitors arrived. Not for mining, not for industry, for history. People came to walk crooked streets, to see buildings that shouldn't still be standing, to stand where fires burned, tunnels collapsed, and thousands once lived. Jerome became a living reminder of the boom and bust cycle that shaped the American West. And slowly, against every expectation, it stabilized. Why Jerome survived? Jerome survived because it changed its purpose. It stopped chasing wealth. It stopped expanding. It accepted limits. Where Bannack vanished, where Ruby fell silent, where Panamint City collapsed, Jerome adapted. Not completely, not easily, but enough. The lesson in survival. Today, Jerome is not a ghost town, but it is haunted by its past. The ground still shifts. Old buildings still crack. The mountain still remembers every tunnel carved into it. But people live here again. Jerome stands as a rare exception in American history. A town that should have disappeared, that nearly did, and that survived by becoming something entirely different.